This is the beginning of session number 2 in the oral history interview with Vera Maxwell. This session is being conducted on the afternoon of March 1st, 1979, again in the apartment of Miss Maxwell. Miss Maxwell, I know that you had a very strong sense of yourself from a very young age, and also, of course, from what you've told us, definitely a sense of style. You reacted, you were a critic, and that came from someplace. And judging from a review of the first interview, I would suggest that that source might be your grandmother, who you did tell us in session 1 was a very important part of your life. Could you maybe go back to that for a moment before we begin the portion of your life where you really step out now on your own and begin your own business? Could you swing back for a moment
Oh,
and just
gladly, if
think
it's
about
about
her
my,
once again?
yeah, if it's about my grandmother, gladly. As a matter of fact, I wrote some lines about her, because my son was in, which is my son Jack was in the war, and he knew my mother, but he never knew my grandmother. So I wrote him this little note, which I thought would be rather nice.
Would you mind
I'll
sharing?
read it if you
Oh,
like.
great,
Yeah.
thank you.
My grandmother, Agnes Torgus, your grandmother, your great grandmother, which would be my son's great grandmother, was Agnes Torgus. She was born in Torgau, Bavaria. I guess that's where the name comes from, Torgau and Torgus. Anyway, the residence of the electors of Saxony, where the mother of George I of England was born. That's an interesting note. She was, my grandmother was of Lutheran religion, and I presume very cultured. She married Alexander Huntham here in America, in Cincinnati, where she met my mother, where she met my grandmother. My maternal grandfather came from a long line of minor German philosophers. When he came to this country, he became a critic of philosophy and music in a German language newspaper called the Staatszeitung in Cincinnati and also in Hoboken. And in Hoboken, he seemed to have given lectures, and I have some of his lectures printed that he gave at the Hoboken Academy. My grandmother, or your great-grandmother, as you know by now, was my champion. Also, she performed miracles at Christmas time. If you had nice Christmases, it was through her that I learned to give you beautiful Christmases. She was always well-groomed, her hair still worn in the style made popular by the beautiful Queen Alexandra of England, curls over the forehead and a French twist in the back. She wore, in my day, black or gray. Gray in the morning, black always in the afternoon, after 3 o'clock, the great coffee time of all of the European countries, except England, where it's 4 o'clock and tea time. Her shirtwaist and skirts, and most of her clothes were shirtwaists and skirts. And I can see why. In that era, many of the skirts were very, very full and heavily lined. And I think they had to be two-piece or they would have fallen apart. And they were very often, the blouses are very often embroidered with net. I don't know whether you'll appreciate being in the army now, these little fashion touches, but after all, your mother is in fashion. They had to be, as I said, two-piece, and full length. My grandmother's black blouses always had a beautiful little white pleating at the neck, or ruching, and also either that or a little ascot of fine batiste, always always edged with fine lace. At the neck, she had wide apart blue eyes and a determined small mouth, and a beautifully shaped, slightly aquiline nose. Her hands were delicate and long-fingered, and though slightly crippled with rheumatism in my time, were capable of making anything with those beautiful hands, from dolls' houses and little millinery shops to painting small oil paintings, make the finest of dolls' dresses, and then still play a rousing schottische on the piano. This I was delighted to dance to. She had a great sense of pride and in herself, and her family without being pretentious, but with a sense of humor. Thinking about her and all she taught me and all she endured, I look back at her with great love and admiration.
Oh, that was quite a piece to write to your son at that time.
He rather liked it, I think.
I'm sure. I couldn't help but think of the lack of that kind of communication today among families or between members of families, that they really don't appreciate or know.
Actually, being in the fashion, I did get a few fashion notes into this, as you know.
Yes.
But, in writing to him, I had to write him a letter a day. At least I felt I should write him a letter or every other day at least, because their lifeline to home were in letters, you see. And we organized the whole family to write letters to my brother and my son while they were away. But it was so dull. I'd have to write the same thing, and he wasn't interested in what I was making for the ladies at the time. And I suddenly thought, this is just one of many letters I wrote to him about his family background. And he loved them. He said he'd never heard it talked about. Of course, his families got more dispersed. There weren't these great big family conflabs that you'd sit around a table and talk about your family, or even have quarrels around the family, which children learned a lot from. At least I did. When I was a child, we all, as I said before, we all sat around the table and were introduced to people like the Shakespearean actress. And my son, of course, had the advantage. I always had older people around, and when he was home, he even learned to make martinis for me at a very early age. He was about 14, I guess, and helped me with. I used to give Thursday nights at home. I got that from my grandmother. She had a Thursday afternoon at home every Thursday, and people would come in. They were not invited. She had open house on Thursdays, and this she got from her grandmother abroad, and that was the thing to do. And that was, of course, at about 3:30 in the afternoon. And they all dropped in anytime. Men used to drop in later to pick their wives up, and then they'd have a glass of wine or something to drink and go on to their homes. But every Thursday afternoon she had this, and I started giving cocktail parties here and there. And when I was first in business for myself, I'm gregarious and I like people, and there were so many people I'd met. And my mother was living with me at the time, and she was marvelous, to have there. Once or twice she stayed with my sister or my brother, and she wasn't there. And one time I invited 5 or 6 people, and fortunately my mother was there that time, and I forgot to come home. And it was my mother who said to me, "Why don't you do what your grandmother did? Have a separate date and you'll remember it." And she said, "Pick a day." So I decided on Thursdays. And so anytime, everybody got to know that I would be home. And I lived at 36th Street and Lexington Avenue at the time in a brownstone house. So it was a marvelous address for all the people in my business, because we all lived around there, including advertising people and people at, Associated Dry Goods, and theater people that I'd met, all came in on Thursday afternoons. And sometimes I had 4 people, sometimes I've had 20. And it was marvelous, because I had the same thing every week, because I felt that not the same people would come every week, and that was easy. I did by that time have a little maid. If my mother was there, we're very well known for stuffed eggs, hard-boiled eggs stuffed with mayonnaise and mustard, and little chicken salad sandwiches or something. We made the same thing every week, so that it became easier and easier to have these Thursday nights at home. And of course, I remember them. I gave it up finally.
How long did that go on for?
It went on all the time that I lived at Lexington Avenue. And it was marvelous during the war, because I did this even before the war. I mean, not just before the war, but during the war. It was marvelous, because we lived right across the street from the Soldiers and Sailors Club. And I left a note there that if they had any young boys that were around, soldiers, and as what is the name for Australia? The Aussies.
The Aussies, right?
The Aussies Club was my son's old club. The Amherst Club had been turned into the Aussies Club, and we particularly asked for non-commissioned officers because the commissioned officers always had these marvelous dates. Everybody took care of them, but very few people took care of they got theater tickets occasionally. One night I do remember a young boy from Australia. His name was Max. And I've never had such a touching experience. And it was made up for all the evenings that I spent doing this. He came in, I had a tiny little kitchen, and after most of them went home, my guests, sometimes a few of these boys would stay. And I'd always have hamburgers in the house, or make a lot of eggs and have scrambled eggs. And they'd always sort of sit around, and there would be maybe 4 or 5 left sitting around. And one of them came into the kitchen, and he looked and he said, "May I help you?" And I said, "Oh, fine." And he came in and I said, "Here, you can butter this bread for me." And suddenly the tears came to his eyes, and he said, "I haven't been in a kitchen and with anybody like this since I left home." And he said, "You don't know what you've done for me." And the two of us were crying in the kitchen because he was so dear. And I put my arms around him, and he really was crying like a baby. And I thought, he was the only one that did that, but you knew that all the rest must have felt something like that. He was a little more emotional about it, and he was the only one out of all those that I entertained, and we must have entertained hundreds in the period of the war that came over. They all went to Canada, and from Canada, where they went. And I often thought, the reason most of them didn't write because they were killed in action. But Max, after the war, and only up until about 5 or 6 years ago, I used to get a letter from Max, and I was so delighted to know that he was still alive.
Isn't
that? It was, as I say, worth giving those parties. I enjoyed them. We used to take them once in a while to those singing groups, the beer sellers. They love it, and sing those marvelous Aussie songs. Dancing, waltzing Matilda. Great moments, during the war, my little war effort.
But you also said you had people from the industry. Who were some of the people that?
One I still see very, very much is Dee Rafdell. She used to be the Associated Dry Goods, and most of the people from Lord and Taylor's, like Harry Rodman and Dorothy Hood. Dorothy Hood lived right around the corner. She was a great illustrator. One of the first to do beautiful wash drawings for newspapers. She was one of my dearest friends. And the heads of AMC, I can't even remember their names now. Stanley Marcus used to come by, and his name, Harold Dawson, I think, the president of Lord and Taylor's. And
haven't you been friended also for a long time with Andrew Goodman?
Andy, no, he never came there. I know Andy very, very well. Andy's sister, whom I liked very much, came. Anne Goodman was a darling woman. She died much too young. One of the vice presidents of Altman's would come. Ferris McGarrity would often. I still see him. He's one of my very good friends too, and is still very much around and a very knowledgeable man. Harry Rodman was one of the most brilliant of the art directors, I think, of not Seventh Avenue, Fifth Avenue. He instigated into sort of institutional ads, not just advertising clothes. But one I remember, the famous one, the picture of the bells at Christmas time, which counterparted the bells that they had in their windows rather than stuffed with merchandise. Dorothy Shaver used to come to these parties occasionally, and her sister, and Claire McCardle, those people I mentioned in my last little session, were the people from Bucks County who often came by.
Louise Dahl-Wolf?
Yes, and Louise Dahl-Wolf and her husband, and
was the point?
Willamette Scal, who was on Vogue at that time, used to come, and Diana Vreeland and Jessica Daves. They all would during the year pop by sooner or later and have a cup of tea or a drink. But it was rather relaxed.
Was it a social or?
Oh,
or
very.
did you get
It was a
into-
nice mixture because I remember that young child actress. Her daughter just wrote a book about her. Margaret Sullivan came, and she had just been to a psychiatrist. And I remember her. My son was quite young at the time, and I had a darling little fireplace with a hob grate, and it was an October day, I remember, and she lay on the floor, and one didn't do those things that long ago. Now people are much freer, and I had hardly met her. I met her through friends of mine that were her guardians or something. Very nice, a very nice couple. And she lay on the floor, and she had a little sweater on that rode up, and a little skirt rode down, and she had the most beautiful little navel I think I've ever seen, this little bare tummy, and my son's eyes popped out because she was a very beautiful girl and just adorable. And she said, my psychiatrist said that I should do anything I want to do right on the spur of the moment. I hope you don't mind. Because I think the conversation stopped. Everybody stopped and looked at her. There weren't too many people there. But she finally sat up and joined the party, and we all. She's a she's a very sweet girl, a woman, and a tragic ending, I think, unfortunately. I can't think of any other people from. I did know Cyril Richard very well. Cyril Richard, I should say, and he was a famous old Australian actor. He didn't come there because the Australians, I don't think. I met him sort of later, but he was a charming man. And what a sense of humor, and what an actor. I think we miss him in the theater, even today. He died only last year, I think. Drew Dudley used to come. He was a PR man, public relation man for, when he just died recently. He was a public relations man for Random House, because he came and wanted me to write a book, about fashion and my life, and by that time I'd met some interesting people, and he wanted me to take the advance check, and I didn't do it. And he said, well, if you don't take it, you won't write the book. But I didn't want to take it because I didn't want to be responsible. And it's true, I've half written a book, but I've never gotten down to write the book, and he's right. Probably if I'd felt guilty enough to write it if I'd accepted the check. Sometimes I wish I had, in a way, not so much for the money as that it would have given me more discipline to write the book. But those Thursday nights ended when I moved up here to 755 Park. Actually, it got a bit out of hand because I love people, but I got rather annoyed when people would use it as a drinking place. And I don't drink that much. And I had wine and cocktails, naturally. My son made the cocktails once in a while. But when people would bring 2 or 3 friends on their way to Greenwich or something like that just to have a drink in my house, I decided when I moved up here it was time to have small dinner parties instead of open house. So I've never had one since. I haven't missed it much, I must say. I did it just the right time. I traveled more then too.
Well, the period that you're talking about is a period that I'd like to pick up with, if we may, and move ahead towards the opening of your business. But about 7 years before you opened your own business, you were featured among the Lord & Taylor windows. I think they were called the Roster of American Designers. That was started by Dorothy Shaver in 1931, I think.
Well, later than that. No?
Was it later? I think it was started in 31,
but it really didn't.
I think it was.
Well, I think her first one was the girl who wrote Fashion is Spinach. What's her name? Helen. She's still around, as a matter of fact. She stopped designing clothes and designed.
Helen Van Slyke?
No.
I'm not aware of the book.
The book is famous. It was at the time.
Yeah.
And she was the first one. She she promoted as an American designer, and I guess she did before my time promote Muriel King.
She promoted Muriel
Yeah,
King? Yes.
Muriel King was one of the American designers, and Germaine Montet, before she went into she designed beautiful clothes, as a matter of fact. I think those are the three that I vaguely remember that she started in with. So maybe those were around 1931.
Yeah.
Ours were later, I think, when she did Actually, it was the war was coming on. Whether she had that in mind, I don't know. But I think she started it by wanting to promote American design, and she quite rightly. She and Mary Lewis, I must bring Mary Lewis and Dorothy Shaver were two of the greatest women, to my mind, in department store merchandising and fashion. Mary Lewis was the one to bring the shirt out, the shirt-waist dress out, as an American classic. And shirt-waist dresses, granted, have always been worn, or the shirt-waist and skirt, as I said, but she brought it into focus and did it in many different colors and many different fabrics. I later on, as I said before, did it in prints, which gave me another leverage, because I've always liked prints. And being very sloppy myself in dressing, I realized that solid colors, I always went out, and liking to look neat, I often would have to take a dress off because I'd see a spot on it if it were plain colored, and somehow or another, with this tiny geometric prints, or tie prints as we call them, I've always used, because they never show any spots, not as much as a solid colored dress. Now we don't have to worry because you have these marvelous polyesters that wash and dry right away.
I think you're right about those windows. I think if I remember correctly, the intent was that the European market was very quickly closing, or being closed to American designers and to retailers, and she recognized that we better do something about it. This country better do something about its own designers to continue the business, so to speak. And I think, in fact, many manufacturers were very much against her at the time for doing it.
A lot of them, some of them that I worked for too, because I used to have to. I always said that I could make 4 suits out of one of those French suits because they'd have so much on them. They have too many pockets, tricky collars, and tricky sleeves, and you could put the sleeves on one suit and make a very new-looking suit out of it, and the pocket design on another suit. And I was never allowed to do it. I used to have to copy them line for line, which of course irritated me with pretensions to being a designer. But one thing that Dorothy Shaver must be given credit for, and I think it's an interesting view on what happened in our market. We're talking about shirts and blouses as a way in my grandmother's day. Well, by the time the 20s came, and the 30s, we made house dresses only, you know, and there was a wonderful, I think it was called L'Aiglon, and they were, I think, from the Middle East somewhere. No, they were Middle Europeans. He was a German, I think. And he made the best house dress in the country. L'Aiglon was the house dress you bought if you had good maids, or you wanted a house dress for yourself to wear in the morning, as my grandmother did her little gray dresses. These were called house dresses. And usually there were 4 maids, but as I say, people would wear them. And Dorothy Shaver took L'Aiglon and asked L'Aiglon to make some very good-looking tailored dresses for general use in cotton. And I think she was responsible for the first charming cotton dresses that we wore, and very nice. They were $8, $9 retail in those days, because he made house dresses for $2.95 and $3. And she saw that his labor was absolutely beautiful. And I even learned from that, because I later on worked on these little print shirt dresses. We never could make them for the price that L'Aiglon did. But then very culpable houses would start making cheap clothes and spewing them out. L'Aiglon must have made 10,000 dresses at a clip. That's why he could make them at that price. I must say, in our in our line, Adler and Adler, they were much more exclusive. We never cut more than maybe 1,000 dresses, which would be a large order. So we had to get more money for them. But even in those days, it was selling for 1975 in pure silk. But the leg-long dresses, to me, were the first great mass-produced dress in this country of great quality. And later on, as I said, there were other people who could do quality merchandise. But then, unfortunately, some of them would get worse and worse because they'd... I think this happens to the clothes even today. When somebody like, well, let's say Furstenberg is a very good example because she has, another girl I can think of, but Furstenberg will do as an example of a later date. She made her whole collection on one wrap dress of different prints, and very often only one or two prints. They were very nice prints, and a marvelous little cotton. And she had them made by very, very good tailors in Italy. Well, they got so popular that she suddenly was making them by the 10,000 and not checking, because there are not that many people, contractors, that can make that many dresses well. And the minute they spew them out in thousands and thousands, the only one that I knew that was able to do it was Legrand. But he and his sons examined every dress, and they were the only people that I had the greatest respect for cheap clothes, inexpensive clothes. They were not cheap. But I think what happens to the big, not so much name people that pride themselves on one dress. Later on, she had to do a tunic dress or something because the wrap dress was out. But she never was a designer, in my way of thinking, to design a collection. I mean, it was a dress, and she made a reputation on it. And the other one was the one that Dorothy Shaver promoted, that did the full skirts with a ballerina type of, not ballerina so much as a crinoline, a dress. Somebody will remember her name. And she did the same thing. She had to make so many and go to lower and lower contractors, or really people with larger and larger factories that could not
command the quality.
You can't command the quality because you can't watch that carefully. And that's the only thing I think. One thing I admire about Sears Roebuck is they have quality control that's par excellence. And they seem to be able to do it because they, like Legrand in his day, which was a separate manufacturer, not Sears Roebuck. But during the war, I had to make things that with Sears Roebuck for the war effort, and also for Montgomery and Ward. Now, Montgomery and Ward also had good quality control, not quite as good as Sears Roebuck. We had to count the inches and the stitches and everything else, and everything they produced. Quality of the fabric, you'd have to send them vast amount of swatches that they would test before they use them. So I've always had great respect for Sears Roebuck for that. That's our greatest mass production place. And I think you get great, if you want to buy a shirtwaist or a sweater, you can buy it with great equanimity if you've got taste. You know, I know that they make good things. A pair of little shorts bought at Sears Roebuck are probably just as good as something that you, unless you're having them made for yourself or you have a particular color or shape in mind that you want, or a difficult figure. But even there, in these places today, they have all figure sizes as well. They have it for old ladies, young ladies, fat ladies, thin ladies.
Every part of the kitchen.
Every part.
Miss Maxwell, in that period, now we're talking, let's say 7 to 10 years before you began your business, you certainly, being the person that you are, I shouldn't say you certainly, I assume that you were looking at designers and what designers were doing, other designers I should say. What was the position of American designers in that period now, of just before the war and during the war? What was the position of American designers in both your mind and or in the eyes of the public. Do you have a sense of what that was all about at that time?
Very early on, I don't think when you're working for somebody and not yourself, you have a very different perspective, because you've got to do. I remember having a great argument, or even almost a fight, with one of the people that I was working for, because I had to, make a coat that I'd made very successful. I copied it from an officer's coat. Again, it was during the war, and it was so successful in their line that ad nauseum I'd have to copy it. And I said, I can't anymore. This is ridiculous. You've got to go on. Well, they were always afraid to go on to something new, and I really had to, I'd gotten tired of making it in different fabrics, and they had to have the same exact coat, and you were controlled from that respect. And I must admit that I don't go that far, but I've often repeated a design, and they were quite right to a certain extent, because I don't think if you have something good, you should put it on your line. You should really put it on your line or in your collection. If it's that good, slightly changed, another season and another season, because Mary Lewis taught me this, even in ads. Put an ad in that sells well again and again, because very often the woman who has seen it will say, this must be good, they're advertising it again, or they haven't seen it before. So in both ways, if it had sold once as a dress, I do that in the New Yorker. I often put the same dress in the New Yorker twice in succession, because I think that it makes a point, and I think Mary Lewis was quite right in that respect. But I don't know whether you have a sense of who you are. I wasn't that much of a designer early in my life anyway. The great challenge to me was the front of windows that Lord & Taylor gave me, and then giving me ads. And from that time on, though I wasn't working for myself, I at least had a sense of identity. You're bound to have a sense of identity if you see a Sunday paper with your name sprawled all over it, and Vera Maxwell's marvelous coat, or whatever they might. And this is my friend Harry Rodman that I liked, and Dorothy Hood. That's why we became such good friends, because I naturally would begin to write letters to Harry Rodman saying how beautiful his ads were, and then I met Dorothy Hood, and the three of us became very, very good friends. It was a great period in my, life style at that time, to know people like that. I was closely identified with Lord & Taylor's, and for that reason would sell L.S. Ayres and Marshall Field and all the other stores that wanted to buy, not my clothes, but through Linker & Herbert, not Linker & Herbert so much as, and not Adler & Adler, because they wouldn't use my name. But this was in the time of Browse and Jacobson, particularly, and Max Milstein.
Could I ask you to, again, in this period now, when you were just really getting on your own, as it were, still, however, under the umbrella of another company, what was your reaction to other designers that were working at the time, Claire McCardle and Charlie James?
I had great respect for Charles James. As I say, I'm diametrically opposed to the way he dressed women, but I think he was a portraitist as far as women went. He saw them as portraits, and of course they were beautifully groomed and beautifully dressed, most of the women, like Mrs. Hearst, and can't think of, there's so many, that he did dress. But I would never make clothes like that. I like comfort and ease and, casualness in my clothes. But I had great respect for him because he did one thing for me. He knew the body well enough to know what he used to call air pockets in a body. This is technical and very hard to explain unless you have a figure there to work on. But he absolutely revolutionized the mannequin figure all across America, because they were all dummies, and I mean really straight ramrod dummies. I used to have a fit because I used to myself put cotton wadding with Scotch tape all around a figure to build it up here and build the stomach up. And that Darling Charlie James came out and worked for Bowman Forms and sued them. And he rightly, I think he was, for once, he was right in suing them because they made a fortune and are still making a fortune on his lines where I had put cotton batting and something. He knew enough to make the whole, that a woman has a bit of a tummy in the back. Usually her back is longer than, her waistline is longer in the back than the front. Her hips are a little more rounded. Not quite such a bust line, not a heavy bust line that they used to do. And I think he was the first to make collapsible shoulders so you could get a dress on. So that this man deserved enough credit just alone for that, for showing us that these air pockets are what he calls it. I unconsciously did it with cotton batting sometimes. It annoyed me that when I'd get a dress on, it didn't look right, you know. And he did that, and also I think I have sketches and pictures of his that are absolutely phenomenal. I wish that he had given up designing dresses entirely and was recognized as one of our great draftsmen. I have some, they're slightly pornographic even, but so beautiful you don't know it until you've looked at it, studied it quite seriously. But they're line drawings of the black and white ink line drawings, the most beautiful things I've ever seen. And someday somebody should give them, I'd love to lend mine. There are a lot of people that have them, and they should be shown somewhere. They're really quite beautiful. But another one the next one I had, Claire McCardle was a great designer. She, faded into the background after Noodleman gave up his business. Unfortunately, Noodleman gave up his business because his sons and daughter-in-laws tried to run it and unfortunately ran a Darling woman out of the business. She couldn't stand them anymore. They were telling her what to make. And Charlie was one of the most wonderful men on 7th Avenue, I think. He, fortunately for me, worked for me a year, but unfortunately died of a heart attack at the end of the year. I hope it wasn't from overwork, because he was a hard worker, that man, but he loved it. He was so glad to be back on 7th Avenue. And actually, I think he had a very, very ill wife at home. And, he used to go home to her because we don't really work very hard in our place, I must say. We work seriously, but it is a nice, relaxed place to work, at least most of my girls say it is. But Claire McCardle, of course, is tops. I think she brought Alix to this country. I mean, Alix's method of designing, which is feminine and casual, and went further than Alix. Alix is still alive and one of our greatest, but I think Claire McCardle made them more American in her prints and the way she brought the ballet slippers and the whole look of a almost 18th century Bronte look into the picture, which is quite sweet. And Germaine Monty, as I say, and Muriel King, I had great respect for. And one of the greatest was Bobby Knox. He's unsung, that boy. He was no boy, but he always looked like a boy. He was older than I was, and I always thought he was 20 years younger. He was a very, very bright, tiny little, small man. But he worked, I think, for Ben Zuckerman?
I think it was.
Yeah. But he made the most divine suits, and he loved fabrics as I did, and was meticulous. I mean, they really made the best suits in the market. Princess Grace still has one of Zuckerman's suits that Bobby Knox designed, and still hangs on to it after all these years. But Nettie Rosenstein was a good classic designer of black dresses mostly, but I mean, she had good taste and a nice way of producing clothes, I think. I can't think of...
Muriel King?
Muriel King I mentioned, yes, she was one of my... She was good when she went to Greece and came back with a whole line of beautiful clothes and beautiful fabrics from Greece. She went out of the picture too early, I think. Used designers like that, they had incredibly good taste. Really like Claire Potter, had essentially very good taste. You know, it was just inbred good taste.
What do you think the effect of Erte was?
Erte to me is a very theatrical designer. I
Yes.
have a book of his, and I looked, and there wasn't one thing that I think I could. There are about, in the whole book, there are only 4 dresses that I would take an idea from. The rest is so, to me, so overwrought, but wonderful in pictures, but I can't see women wearing them. He did so many things with, you know, a cape, with one side of the cape away, and just you wear a cape on one shoulder, in other words, and always, very often, just which I still don't like today. This is my own personal taste, mind you, with one sleeve off and, you know, one sleeve on. I did design one myself one time and wore it once, just for my personal use, and never liked it. But they were either over embroidered or always overdone. My theory has always been to take it off, you know, whatever I like. I guess I got that from having to work on those very elaborate coats and suits I had to use, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Even, I remember in my day, Suzanne Lenglen was just fading into the picture of tennis. But, yes, we did have the girl who wore the little lace panties much, much later. But she was really the laughingstock of English and American tennis players because of her long, intricately cut dresses, you know, with embroidery on the top. And we used to literally make fun of them. And, go, you know, first, I still have the first tennis dress I made for Dorothy Bullock with a little pleated skirt, and very, very simple. Of the first sort of cotton, not cotton, but nylon and rayon jersey that was very, very popular. But I made a lot of separate skirts with little separate sweaters for tennis. But we were trying to get to the very simplified sports things, as the English always have. They're very austere in their sport clothes, as they should be, I think. I don't like our ski clothes today. I think they're all overwrought, and some of the little suspender types are rather sweet. Like, you can wear a thin sweater under it, or the overall type of ski suit I rather like. But I don't like the sort of +4 type that hang loose. And if you skied a lot, I think they're very, you know, the snow gets up your pants if you fall in the snow. Unless you're an expert skier, I suppose you're all right.
That was the sense of your design, even at that time, wasn't it? A simplistic approach
Oh
to
yes,
design.
very. I
Which
like
for
comfort.
you was style.
Which I think is a certain style as well. Listen, Artes is a great stylist from that point of view, and his style, as Charlie James was, is opposed to my type of designing and living. I mean, I just think clothes should essentially, so that you can forget them, because you cannot, today more than ever, I think you cannot appear somewhere, as I used to say, like a dressed up circus horse, you know, and feel like you're not going into a circus, presented at a circus like Barnum and Bailey or something. I mean, that's gone out of style, fortunately. I think, except for perhaps today the disco set that are trying to find all sorts of vibrations in their clothes, like they now have electric lights in their shoes and electric lights around their necks that you light up with a little. I had a guest come in here the other night with an enormous, about a 5-inch heart, and suddenly she was on a purple dress and this bright red heart, and she went around turning. I was wondering why she was turning some of the lights out, and she's a darling woman. I love her. She was doing it for a joke, and she evidently turned this on, and it lit up like this enormous heart, throbbing. You know, that's a typical disco bit of jewelry, for instance. Mm-hmm. And again, that's for another style. It's just, I love style of all kinds. I have I should photograph that to take down or have reproductions of it made. It's in color, needless to say. But once I was trying to explain style to somebody, you know, and I did a collection that I said, I believe in style, but this is my style. And I said, I believe in I have a picture of Einstein with his gray sweater and an open shirt and his fuzzy white hair. I have the Archbishop of Canterbury with his mitre and ecclesiastic robes. It's another style. I have a London char lady sitting on a bench in London with this crushed hat and a bit of fur around her neck, and she's got style. I have the Prince of Wales, who certainly had style of his kind. And I have a woman and a baby who the baby has a little cap on and the mother has a little black cap on, and they look very much alike, and they both have style in their way. But I was trying to make a point, because when I say style, is very much against fashion. Fashion is something you hook up. You can't consider either the Bishop of Canterbury or Einstein to have a fashionable sense. He has style, Bishop of Canterbury has style because he has his ecclesiastical robes to wear, which gives him a certain style. Mm-hmm. And I must admit that the Prince of Wales set a certain style. And you can go on for years and years. I think there are men today who look like the Prince of Wales, you know, in their casual dressing. And he set that as against English gentlemen in the Edwardian era, since he came at the very tail end of the Edwardian era, into making things more casual, because they wore +4s on golf courses. But he brought in the gray flannel slack with the Oxford bag, which they're still wearing today, you know. But if you can still look like the Prince of Wales and have that kind of style, that you're not following fashion from that point of view.
Excuse me, what was there a sense of, again now, forgive me for dwelling in this period immediately before you went into your own business, but I think it's important to get a full picture of your perspective at the time. Do you remember having a sense of European designers at that time, generally, or perhaps even more
I have
important?
my favorites. I mean, Molyneux, certainly Chanel. I have really used Chanel as a pattern, you know, as someone to really follow. She took everything off. I mean, I don't know of anything she ever made that was cluttered up with. She'd make a black lace dress, but it would be utterly simple. I mean, or another black dress. I think a very nice fashion note that I don't know whether many people know about. Chanel was known for her little black dresses, you know, and they became a style, but a complete style, not just a quick fashion turnover. And now I heard this by some people who were old enough to wear her. They're my age, so they were wearing her little black dresses in 1921 and 22. And evidently she did the little black dress, not as a style again, or not to put a new fashion out, but she had enormous clientele, as you know, and 50% of the French women, even in those days, were in black 6 months of their lives, because if any part of their family died, close member of their family died, they wore black for 6 months at least, and then gray, and Grace of Monaco will do the same thing. She wears it for 6 weeks instead of 6 months, but for 6 weeks she'll wear black. When her father-in-law died, Prince Pierre, she wore black for 6 weeks, and then gray, and then the summer came and she wore lavender. But that's still because she's in a position where she has to create an ambiance. But in Chanel's early time, they were at least 6 months in black. So she had to design an awful lot of black clothes for women and decided they should look chic, or they wore black, and they'd come in with a black dress at the tail end of their ready for something pretty. And of course they could wear white in summer. But she did the black dress because there were so many French women that had to wear black, so she said they might as well look chic in black, instead of wearing these dowdy black clothes that they hung on to because they thought they didn't have to look chic in mourning. And she really did the black dress so that they could look chic in their black clothes, which I think is an interesting comment, because I always thought that the little black dress sort of arrived because she thought it would be a good idea. the basic black dress, as we called it. Well, the basic black dress was really had its conception, not inception, in that particular instance.
Were American designers in awe of the French designers or European designers at that time?
Yes, I think that the department stores were. I don't know whether even, I think American women of a certain type are. At the same time, they're wearing Gucci's all over the place, you know, or not only Gucci's, but you have to have this or you have to have that because your neighbor has it. Mm-hmm. Well, I think there are a lot of women that went abroad for their clothes. You know, because they were French, they didn't feel that they were any good unless they were French.
How about American designers, though? I mean, did they respect what was being done by the French, or
well, the American designers were sent abroad. I think a lot of them were sent abroad to copy clothes. Well, you see, my bosses went abroad. In his day, Mr. Linka's sister, Amy Linka, her business is still going in France. And he used to go over and bring these things back that I would have to copy from France. And you had I had a very nice instance happen. I might as well tell it here because it's appropriate. I designed a coat, and it must have been in the time of Victoria Regina, the play on Broadway that Harold Prince was in, playing Prince Albert, and Helen Hayes was Queen Victoria. And I went to see, and very often, naturally, a designer gets ideas from clothes in the theater and the movies. But he had a marvelous dressing gown on. It was red velvet with a button back that fell into a beautiful pleat. It was sort of biased back, and it fell into the most beautiful pleat with two big buttons. And the front had a shawl collar. And I went back and I designed a plaid, a beautiful Scotch tweed in plaid, and had the whole back was biased, the front was not on the bias, with a little shawl collar. The red velvet collar, I had a dark red velvet collar, and it was in a red and navy blue plaid. And the back was the same as the Prince Albert dressing gown. And it was advertised, and it was I showed it, and Lord and Taylor's bought it and advertised it as a Vera Maxwell. And a year later, Saks Fifth Avenue had the dress, had the coat, the same coat as I designed in plaid, had it in their window, had it in a big, I have the ad somewhere, had it in their ad, this beautiful copy of an Alex coat. Well, I took the ad and gave it to Alida Ben Wessop, who was the head of the advertising department at Lord & Taylor's. Sort of in an amused sense, isn't this rather funny? And she was incensed by it, and she said she knew Alex, and she was Alex, you know, the designer. And she said, I'm going to send it to Alex. It may, you know, I said, well, you know, we both might have had the same idea. And she sent the clipping and a letter to Alex. And I have that letter, and Alida Ben Wessop sent me the letter, and she said, no, I never designed a coat like this. And for me, it was very nice because she said it's an elegant coat. I like it very much, but I did not design it. And she was properly incensed at Saks Fifth Avenue for using her name. You know, all right, so it ended up nothing was done about it, needless to say, but it was a rather funny incident, you know, that happened.
That kind of thing, we know, happens a lot, continues to happen today.
I guess so, yeah.
With people, there's confusion over who originated what, who innovated what, who promoted what. I'm not sure, even in the present, that kind of thing is going to be taken care of.
Oh, it can't be, as I said before, you know, with those 5 or 10 great corporations on 7th Avenue, and we're not nearly anything like a General Motors. I don't think we can. We never can get together. That was the nearest thing. That Fashion Originators Group was the nearest thing to several corporations getting together to have some force, and it didn't work. You know, it's that's just an amusing incident, I think. You know,
Yes, yeah.
what happened, and one doesn't do anything about it. And there are many things that you design, that you think you designed, that you found out somebody thought about long before you did.
Yeah. Wasn't there, in 1940, you mentioned Claire Potter earlier, wasn't she the first United States designer to be copied abroad?
Yes, she was, and I had proof of that. Uh, I went abroad in earlier than I think it was It was before the war, certainly. I went abroad in 1938. It was just before the war, and no, it was even earlier than that. My son had a mastoid operation when he was 6, and I was stuck abroad, as a matter of fact. I had to stay there because she was in the hospital for quite a while. I was fortunately visiting my sister, and I had to work. I wanted to. I loved keeping busy, and I must have had a leave of absence of some kind from my work. And I walked into Fortnum Mason. I'd always adored that shop, and they hired me. But England being more realistic in their labor laws than we are, I guess, I was only there for 6, or not even, I was there for 2 weeks when somebody, an inspector or something, came in and said, "Aren't you Vera Maxwell?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "May I see your passport?" And I couldn't work there any longer because I was not an English citizen. But we don't have any, you can't curtail people in this country at all. We have I was impressed by that, really, that in 2 weeks' time they know exactly where I was. You know, Scotland Yard I have the deepest respect for. I really love it. I mean, I'm not because I lost my job through it, but I had great respect for what they did. But to get back to my original story, while I was at Fortnum & Mason, I learned a lot about Chanel there, because they had an enormous amount of Chanel suits. And I also I modeled there. You know, I was really a model before I was actually a designer. And but still interested in clothes. But I said the inception of Chanel came from those beautiful clothes I modeled and saw there. And one day I put on a dress, and I knew Claire McCardell very well, and it was her gaucho. She got tired of making the little slim shirt dresses.
Claire McCardell or
Claire Potter. Yeah. Claire Potter's gaucho dress, and she copied it from the South, the Argentinian gaucho, with a great big wide sleeve that rolled up, and a loose collar, very much like single-collared shirts the men wear now, you know, not folded back, with a very simple little sort of Chinese-y collar. And I said, "Good Lord, this looks exactly like Claire McCardell's." And it had a Paris label in it. And I even bought the dress, much to because it was quite expensive. But it was very good looking. And I bought it, but I also bought it to bring back to Claire, to see and compare the dresses. And then she finally, I think, did a study on that and found out that somebody, I know how it was traced. She found out that one of the French buyers had been in this country and bought one of her dresses. And I don't remember which one it was, really. I should remember. But bought the dress and went back and had it or a buyer. No, it was a buyer from one of the big stores in France or something. Came to this country, bought the dress and brought it back to have copied, to put in Maison Blanche or one of the good then boutiques of the kind. And it came back to this country as a French dress, which is nice little note.
Robin. Yes, exactly.
But I think before I was saying that I go now to so many French homes, and I know so many young French women are quite interesting to know. And even in those days, when I'd go to Paris with my sister, the really chicest French one would be copying the English woman. As the chic French, or you can't call him chic, the well-dressed Frenchman always tries desperately to look like an Englishman. He doesn't ever quite make it. He does more or less today. But in those days, he always swished around a little bit for some reason or other. Or the tie was too bright, or the shirt was not, like an English shirt. But they tried desperately to have that casual look at the, just as today, whiskey is a great thing. They don't drink wine anymore, unfortunately. I think they're complaining, the French wineries are complaining that the Frenchman is drinking too much whiskey. It's terribly chic to have a bottle of whiskey now instead of a bottle of wine or an aperitif, which is amusing. And the camel's hair coat was a badge of distinction in France, even 2 years ago when I went over. What surprised me, 2 years ago I went with Grace to some 2 or 3 luncheons in Paris, some of them out, some of them in. At least 5 or 6 young women, sometimes more. My goodness, they all arrived with twin sweaters and tweed skirts that I hadn't seen since Mary Lewis's day again, and where I used to make skirts, and I didn't have anything to do with the sweaters. They came from Ballantyne's or someplace in England, but I did the skirts for the sweaters. And there wasn't a Vassar girl that didn't have a best in company tweed skirt and twin sweater set with pearls and a little half circle pin. I mean, you weren't in it unless you had that. And here, about 40 years later, I see the French women with sweaters. It's a great badge of distinction to have a Ballantyne sweater. It must be a Ballantyne or one of the other good English or Scottish sweaters. And it must be a Scottish tweed skirt or an English tweed skirt, and a camel's hair coat. That was these were the chicest women, the top echelon of the good-looking young French women. What I did learn from young French women, since I was almost always old enough to be their mother, and once in a while the grandmother, but it amused me because knowing American women and being with them all the time, and knowing my American women, it always amused me that our girls were brought up, were sort of put on a pedestal, and they were knocked off by hopefully the well-established young man, more or less still put them on a pedestal. And this is where momism came from. And looked at them as a feminine symbol, of something that must be idolized in a way. And I think if you talk to young women, they would talk about their wedding day, if that split their lives in two. The wedding day was the day that they got married, and then their whole lives would change. As if, it does change your life in some respect, but you should have learned something before that time about human nature, about men, but they approached marriage as this day in their lives, that their whole either life was going to be better or sometimes worse if their husbands were chosen from them. Very seldom happened. Abroad, the young women would talk about men in a very realistic fashion, I found. These are all young married women by the time I met them. I loved the girl who was quite sexy and would say, talking about marriage and infidelity and so on and so forth, and one would say, well, she said, the first one that opened up said, I have 3 children and I love my children, and it's all right if I don't know what John does during the week, it doesn't make any difference to me. He said, I love it if he leaves me alone. I mean, and her attitude was that I've got my children, but he's always home on Saturday and Sunday when I have to go to my parents, and he's always there when we have to go to the theater. But he said, I have so much to do taking care of my children in my house. The idea that sex was a little too much for her. And the sexy little one was up and said, well, listen, when I'm through with John, if he has time for another mistress, that's all right with me. I mean, she knew full well that she was taking care of him physically, right up to the hilt. And the other one was so interested in her business that she also has had a marvelous sort of, sex was there, but she and her husband were very interested in what they were doing, very intellectual, both of them, you could see. And their attitude was so different than I've ever heard. American women are leading into that now, I think. It's the only thing I like about Women's Lib, is that it gives women this feeling that they should know more about sex and life and bringing up children before they get married. A girl that was going to marry and have children undoubtedly decided that if her husband did want to have a mistress, it was all right with her because she was going to have a lot to do. She loved her children, was terribly maternal minded, and marvelous mother.
That's interesting because in the last few days, in one of the publications, one of the news magazines, or I can't remember now where I did read it, but a recent survey has been done on American women, and sex received the lowest percentage of interest.
That's good.
It was one step below housekeeping. The housekeeping was even more important than sex, as far as this study was able to determine. So
I think it should be a little higher than that. I think it should be better than housekeeping. But I don't think it should, no, I really don't think it should have a paramount. Anything, any more than fashion should have. This is why I like simple clothes, because I think fashion being the paramount, leitmotif of some women's lives is abhorrent to me. That's what I love about the Princess Grace. I mean, she has her children to take care of, a very, in a way, difficult husband because he's got a tremendous background and fortunately a great sense of humor, but he's got a typical provincial south of France type of temperament, which is very flamboyant, you know, and she has a lot to take care of. She has a Red Cross and her painting, and she gets into so much that clothes mean very little to her. Sex has some importance in her life, I hope, and does, but her children, again, it's beautifully divided, her life, I think, as most women should be. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a place for sex, and I think, therefore, if there are courtesans around, I think we should have a place for them. If sex is paramount in their lives, and men look to these women for that, as a release from a wife who gives them a lot of other things but sex, maybe, because there's so many categories in life that are interesting. I don't believe so much I do believe that faithfulness in marriage is a lovely thing, but I think if you have some kind of humor or sensitivity in life, like this young girl who says, you know, if he has a mistress, it's all right with me as long as he's home with when I have to see my family and have to go to the theater and go out and go shopping with me. He's always there, which means you spend a half a day with you know, she could take that in her stride, which I think is quite logical in a way. It's not very moral, perhaps, but I think since it's part of life and you don't dwell on it, as she didn't, it's fine. If it makes you terribly unhappy, that's another thing. I think that and you better get a husband who isn't polygamous, or not be polygamous yourself.
I want to get back to some of these topics, Ms. Maxwell, because I know that, or I have a sense anyway already, that fashion plays a very small part in your life, or a smaller part than one would think. It should play, perhaps, in the life of a designer. I'd like to get back to that a little bit later, but I'm concerned that, forgive me for my concern for chronology, but I want to get back to the beginning of your company.
Well, I started, yeah.
I think,
well,
I think there was a period before you actually began the company when circumstances were sort of forcing you down that road. Do you remember when you first began thinking about opening your own business? Was it years before you did, or were there some circumstances?
No, I think I was more or less forced into it because I was quite happy designing for other people. I liked people well enough and got along very well with them, except for one or two instances when I objected. But I don't know whether I did go into the fact that I worked for two manufacturers that used we did go into that, I think. Mm-hmm. Well, I think it was the second episode that soured me on working again and building up a business for a Seventh Avenue contractor, really, or even working for anybody that was not a contractor that would hire me as a designer, because I really have a very optimistic nature. By that time, I was getting very, very cynical about my chances of ever making the grade on my own, of making really enough money and not being fired after making money for the firm.
Well, was that your intent in going into business, to establish yourself financially, a sense of security?
No, more a sense of also not having to I think that I wanted to go further in designing because I was curtailed. You are curtailed quite rightly by uh, uh, people who work for, and they have a right to tell you not to make this, and they don't want to use this fabric, and they don't want to use that, they don't want to experiment. And I wanted to be on my own, so I could design, and I was being, I suppose, in a way, I'm not a loner because I'm very gregarious, but I'm a loner in the sense that I have never worked really well to my satisfaction with other people. I've never been able to do exactly as I wanted. And I felt that I could give a little more to the design picture of clothes or style in America by doing things on my own and finding fabrics and looking for new things. It was that, plus the fact that I'd become a little cynical about ever being able to work for anybody else or making. Money has never been a particular object with me. Even by this, I still had to worry about getting a son through college, and which, as everybody knows, takes some money. But it wasn't wasn't my paramount excuse. My excuse was money to send my son through college. And there you have to have some money for. And I suppose the fear of being fired always. And I thought, well, I could lose everything I'd made by this time, $50,000 in the bank. And that's about all I had. Well, I did risk that. And I very smartly started in a little side street. There, I think I was very, very smart.
Could I ask you, before we actually get into the reality of opening, or the happening of opening your business, as it were, when you began the actual planning of the business, now this is before the doors opened and perhaps circumstances forced you to make some changes, but in that creative period when you were thinking about your own business, do you remember what your concerns were towards such things as the scope of your business? To whom did you want to address your effort? I mean, were you still aiming at the customers that you had developed now over the period of the last several years?
I don't, frankly, I always keyed myself to Lord & Taylor's because this was my showcase after all. I got all the other stores through Lord & Taylor's. Now Lord & Taylor's, to my mind, has fallen down in intrinsic value, putting a rather harsh name on it. I think they're cheapening their clothes, and they were literally the leading criterion of fashion for a certain kind of woman. Bergdorf was something else again. That was the almost ready to wear, made to order shop, you know. Saks Fifth Avenue had it was a rather nouveau riche, I must say. Saks Fifth Avenue always had the rather nouveau riche kind of clientele, very expensive and beautiful clothes. Mm-hmm. But I think Lord & Taylor's, through Dorothy Shaver, hit the keynote of America, right at the nail, right on the head. And I happened to come in at that particular time, so that my clothes are very American. I did collections of among others, of Huckleberry Finn and you know, that sort of thing, really middle American clothes and things of that sort. And I keyed myself on that thing, and my clothes happily fell in a category of upper middle class people across the country. Not the very, and also the working girl, you know, who needed good clothes to appear in those days. I can't say anything for what we're doing now. It's an entirely different picture than it was in 1947.
Mm-hmm.
In 1947, I could still make a hand-tailored Irish tweed suit with a pure silk lining to sell for $49. I have them all in my book. They're all registered, and registered under the labor laws. I made coats. I have ads of Lord & Taylor coats of $59 in beautiful West of England flannel with velvet collars for $59. So my keynote was this great American young woman, young working woman, young mother, on the young side as a rule. But my keynote too was not to mention young too much or stress it. It was for a woman of any age that liked simple clothes and liked wearable clothes that she could wear. And I always made this statement whenever I did a collection on travel. I say, you know, traveling on a bus from your job to work, or traveling on a train from Bronxville to New York, or traveling to Hong Kong for that matter. The clothes had to fit the same purpose. And this is where my mind was playing. I never thought really outside of working through Lord & Taylor's, except for that, strangely enough, my clothes still, at $169 with a $49 suit, still hits that class of woman, because she can afford now the $169 suit, the $200 suit, as against Jeffrey Bean $1,500 suit that I saw hanging next to mine one day, much to my surprise. I didn't realize that he got that much for Jeffrey Bean. His bean bag is something else, the little dresses he makes. I'm not considering those, but I'm considering his tailored suit. And I think mine can easily be looked at in category of his, but a lot of people don't know that because I'm not publicized as much as he is. Because he sells to all the department stores. And I don't know whether you know it or not, I don't sell department stores anymore. And that for a very definite reason.
Yes, I do know that, and I want to, again...
That's later on in my career,
right,
too.
Exactly. The climate, the business climate at the time that you opened, we know that roughly in 1939, and I think I'm correct in this, the retail dress market was about $900 million in the United States. By 1945, it had almost doubled.
Oh, yes.
So you were really, I guess in a sense, there was a positive market within which you were working at the time, and within which you were beginning to develop the concept of opening your own business. You mentioned briefly earlier the financial structure, or the fact that you had about $50,000 in the bank by this point, that you were willing to go into the business. Can you discuss for us a little bit, in fact, the financial structure, how you got started?
Well, it was a very difficult time to find something, you know, that particular time because of the war. See, in 47, we were still suffering from the aftermath of the war, and there were not many lofts. Nothing had been built. But I suppose it didn't take much courage, since I had already, with 2 houses, proved to myself, because they had no background when I had absolutely no customers when I went with them, that I had raised their business to $2 million before I left. So I had, and also I had the security blanket of Lord & Taylor's, who bought at least, it must have been more than $500,000 worth of clothes from one or two either of those houses. So I thought I'd have a reasonable expectancy of that, and also from Dorothy Shaver's loyalty to me, and wanting, they couldn't use my name, you see, and my name by that time was important in ads, and Lord & Taylor must have spent $1 million on Sunday ads over the period of 5 or 6 years. So spending my money wasn't that, although it's always a great, whether you can run a business or not, you know, or have the ability to run a business for yourself. Because I did have one man who I wanted as a partner, and he refused. He was my chief cutter, but he came from Linker and Herbert, and he was 65 years old at that time. And they retired him. Linker and Herbert sort of put him out. So fortunately, he came to me, but he wouldn't put a nickel in my business. But he was a great lifesaver to me because he was a marvelous man. And fortunately for me, he wouldn't take a partnership. He made more money than I did. He wanted an exorbitant salary at the time, which I thought, but I paid it because I knew that I needed somebody that was going to watch my factory and cut my clothes out to my satisfaction. So that was a point in common. I found on a side street a little building. I think it was 135 East 39th. 105 was across the street, so it must have been 112 East 39th. I'm not sure the exact address. A rather shabby building that had a lot of contractors in it, and it had a horrible-looking lobby. It fortunately had a marble floor, and it had a little marble, maybe 6 foot up on the side, and rather shabby-looking elevator doors. And I looked at I had a floor through there for $3,000 a year, which is when you think of it now, you wouldn't be able to find anything like that. But as I say, it was a contractor's loft. And the first thing I did was I had made some arrangements with the people who owned the building and had to sign a lease. And I said, I'll sign a lease, but if I pay out of my own money pocket to do the lobby over, would you permit me to? Because I realized that if people were coming in there, I'd like a decent-looking lobby. And I didn't like the box they had the names in. It was rather ugly, so I had been places where they had very good-looking nameplates and things, and that was the first thing. And that cost $150, I remember. I put wallpaper above the marble, very pretty wallpaper, and I painted the doors and put wallpaper in the door things, and then had it shellacked, because I practically did this with a little man myself. And then on my floor, when you opened the door, I had very little room, I must say. I had a big factory in the back, but entrance part, I owned the whole floor, so when you got out of the elevator, I had my bookkeeper there who acted as a watchdog as well to see who was coming in or out. And I did that all over in very pretty ivy wallpaper and green, and carpeted it and industrial carpet. And what I liked about that was that so many of the people in the building saw it, and they thought, well, if I could do it, they could do it. And when I left that building, there were many floors that had changed their lobbies and papered them and painted them. And it gave me a feeling of, the little Rolling Stone, or it's not really a good example, but it pleased me that first they couldn't believe that anybody would pay of their own money to have the lobby fixed for the whole building. That absolutely floored them, I think. And I had great respect in that building. And there was one floor, I had a man who was making uniforms for TWA and other airlines. And he sent me customers from the West Coast that had small stores that they were dressing the girls. And so I had great rapport for that. It was a little difficult for my customers because we were otherwise in a bigger building. I forgot where we were, but it was on 498, one of them, I think. Anyway, I opened my showroom with the same furniture that I again had bought for Milstein's. I had bought a second-hand, beautiful Victorian horsehair couch that I still have in my showroom today, that I paid $35 for, and 2 beautiful chairs that are still in my showroom, and a library table that I cut down for a coffee table. And those are in my original showroom, because I did away with those ghastly-looking dividers that I loathed in showrooms, and I thought I spent as much time in my showroom as I do in my home, or more even. So I liked it always to look like a living room. And I used to serve, I was probably, one is never the first, but I was certainly one of the people, manufacturers and designers on 7th Avenue that made, I hope, buying clothes a kind of event. I'd give them coffee and always give them lunch as they were around, and tea in the afternoon, and always train my young girls who acted as models or whatever they did to, do this sort of thing and act like hostesses as well. And I've always been known for being a very comfortable, not the most modern of, I never cleared out everything and decided to have a modern showroom per se. But I loved that first little showroom of mine because I had a great success there.
It's interesting the way you describe it, because the day or so after your opening, Women's Wear Daily had an article about your opening and said that your showroom, and I quote, "Your showroom has the informal atmosphere of a pleasant drawing room rather than a commercial office."
Well, I'm glad they noticed that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So that your total investment was less than $50,000.
Less than $50,000
to get started.
Yeah. And a strange thing happened. I was very well known in the fabric field. People like well, I can't remember, not Forstmann, but the smaller fabric houses that I did business with. I don't even have to mention their names. It doesn't matter. Two of them are out of business anyway. But before I went into business for myself, they'd say, anytime you want to go into business, Mrs. Maxwell, we will back you to the hilt. We love the way you work. Anytime you want $50,000, let me know. And fortunately, I didn't depend on them because none of them came through. Not one of them ever came through. There are three very important houses that all said, anytime you need the money, we'll back you. This was while I was buying fabrics from them for another house. I still bought fabrics from them later on because they were very good houses. But it's just as well because it's wonderful to do things on your own. And there again, as I said, I was very lucky not to have a partner. So I thrived the first year. You usually don't thrive the first year, I hear, in a business. But I made all my commitments the first year.
What did your personnel consist of when you started out, do you remember?
Always outside of the factory because that's sort of a separate entity.
Right.
I had my chief, the man I told you about, Mr. Abe Goodman, was my right-hand man.
He was your cutter.
He was what the French call a premier. He made your first pattern and cut the patterns out and watched the first things and was the head of your designing room as well, or helped you in your designing room. I had a very nice young girl, unfortunately I can't remember her name, who helped me in my cutting room, in my sample room. I had to have, of course, two sample hands that are really on the factory end again. I always had two sample hands. Both of them were men in those days. Now they're both women. I had just one girl outside. I had the bookkeeper sitting outside. This is my first year. The bookkeeper was sitting outside by the telephone with a little open, again, my architectural know-how came in. They had this little opening in the entrance hall that was just big enough for her and her bookkeeping table and in those days you had to have a bigger telephone thing than you have now. Then you walked into the door and my girl would be right behind a little screen, so that went into her room and she would take care of the showroom. The showroom was very small, so I had her, and we always had a little commissary department. Even in that day I had a little closet that we had could make a cup of tea and a tiny little icebox, and then I had my workroom and just this one girl working for me that made sketches, and forgotten her name, but I still have her sketches. She hasn't signed one. She's a sweet little girl, and I wish I could remember her name. And then actually that was all that I had to work with. And when I gave a small collection, I would hire models. In those days, models were $20 an hour, which was exorbitant as far, it was terribly expensive in those days. Now they're $100 an hour. Some of them I used to get from Barbizon for $5 an hour, and I used to like an untutored girl because I often would get a girl even to work for me steadily that was untutored as a model, because I'd rather have the nonchalance built into them that I would give them than to have a stagey appearance, so they'd have these silly little walks, that they learned, which were awful. I used to try to get a girl with good background because they would not only not be disdainful about serving tea, because if they came from good families, their mothers would have taught them how to make tea and not think it was infra-dig to make a cup of tea. Some girls that I had are very inferior backgrounds would look at me haughtily and say, "I'm not going to make tea for anybody. What do you think I am, a servant?" And I would immediately let them go because they had that attitude. They weren't for me. I always liked girls, whether they came from, I have girls that come, I don't mean low class or even poor. I have a girl now that came to me when she was 17 years old. Two like that came from the same place. They came from Perth Amboy. All European backgrounds, large families. The one I have, Donna, I have today, had 4 brothers and 4 sisters besides herself. She came to me when she was 16 years old. The one I had before that is now a widow living on Sutton Place South. She married a very wealthy man, came to me when she was 16, completely unschooled. And I remember buyers, and this was very long ago, buyers saying, "Oh, she's so shy, I wish she would have a girl that had one." I said, "Give her time." And by the next season, she would have had that head up, but that shy little look that they always have, that they never lose when they come from that kind of background, or a good family background is what I always look for, in a girl. And I've had many like that have worked for me. They don't have to be college bred. I had a college bred girl. My favorite story about getting a girl out of college, which happens even more today, and I gave her a letter to write, because even if they modeled, they had to type a little bit or do something around, the office. And I used to give letters to these girls, and I said, "Read the letter," and then I'd say, and if it was somebody that I had to thank for an ad they sent me, I'd say, "This is the letter, and this is the woman's name," and I would say, if I say, "Dear Jane," I will also answer it affectionately, Vera. If I say, "Dear Mrs. So-and-so," I usually sign it sincerely, but just read the letter and say, "Thank you very much," and so forth and so on. And I gave this young girl a letter, and I had written these lines, saying, "Dear Jane, thank you so much for sending the thing," and so forth, meaning that she should write the letter. And on my paper, which is about 9 inches long, and it's a little bit smaller than legal paper, way up in the corner she had, "Dear Jane, thank you for the pictures you sent, etc, etc," and way at the bottom, leaving a blank space, she had put, "Affectionately yours, Vera." I could never believe that I was 8 years old when I learned how a letter should be spaced. You leave a little room at the top and the body of your letter, and I've kept that letter. I think it's one of the funniest things I've ever read. And she was a Skidmore graduate. But anyway, to get back to my little cubbyhole there, I think I must have been there 3 years. And then I met Herbert Sondheim in Canada. We were doing a collection in Canada, an invitation at Eaton's. And I had great respect always for Herbert Sondheim. He was not a designer, but he had a very good business, and a wonderful businessman. And he said to me, "You're doing so well there." He said, "Hattie Carnegie is leaving us, and we'd love to have you I'd love to have you in my building." And I said, "Oh, it sounds terribly extravagant." And he said, "No, I don't think for today." You were still paying under the table for things at that time. Actually, Bruno was doing Spectator Sports wholesale for Hattie Carnegie. And Bruno had been fired, unfortunately. I don't know why, but it was an expensive product. They only made, I have a whole factory there, and they just made samples in that place. And I thought of the waste of space. But anyway, I went over to see Herbert when we got home from Canada, and looked at the space, and I thought, oh, it's magnificent. If I could ever really run this, I think I'd be in seventh heaven. And then I found out that it would cost me $5,000, which was really not much, but that was really under the table. But actually, since Hattie Carnegie was a very wealthy woman and their business was terrific, you know, and they wanted to get out for a number, I dealt with Hattie Carnegie's brother, who was charming. And what I paid for, which was absolutely nothing, were the rug in the showroom, the beautiful mirrors in the showroom, the curtains, the furniture, all in the showroom. And they had petitions, which I got rid of, but I kept the tables and the chairs that are now in my son's office, at his business office, being a doctor, his doctor's office. But I took the chance, and I gave them $5,000, and I paid $10,000 a year rent. And I thought I was signing my life away when I signed. The other lease didn't bother me for $3,000. I always felt I could gather $3,000 together, but $10,000 a year and a $5,000 down deposit. More than that, I think I had to pay a deposit as well. It was something like $8,000 that I had to put down, and then sign my life away because I couldn't do it as a corporation. I was incorporated by that time, which I did for my own protection. But I couldn't sign the lease as a corporate owner. You had to sign it as a personal owner, which meant that I would be personally responsible for $10,000 a year, which I mulled on for a long while. And Darling Herbert Sondheim said, don't forget, if you have a good business back there, when they come up to see me, we'll send them down to see you, dear. And he said, all of us will, you know, Carmel Brothers, and they were really, it's a wonderful place to work. I never had any problems about being a woman or being they were the dearest friends, not all of them, but most of them were very, very dear friends. And I can't say enough for the camaraderie that goes on in a business like that.
You just mentioned a point that I wanted to touch on, as a matter of fact, right at this time. You were the first woman manufacturer among the then several hundred members of the Industrial Council of Cloak, Suit, and Skirt Manufacturers Incorporated. Did you notice negative attitudes towards you? I mean, were there negative pressures or
no,
unjust
never.
pressures?
I've never had any negative pressures at all. Mr. Linker of Linker and Herbert happened to be the president of the ladies. You know, I had to join it because, see, I was really not considered a designer. I was a tailor. And really, my clothes are more tailored than draped. I mean, I do a few dresses that are drapey now, but most of them are cut like, a dress is cut like a tailored suit, really. So I'm really a tailor rather than a designer as such. And I handle fabrics in a different way maybe than other people might handle them. But the only incident that I thought was rather revealing, being a woman, was they used to have a meeting once a year, a great big dinner, and cocktails at first at the Hotel Astor. And I went the first time for curiosity's sake, and also because Mr. Linker said, you must come to one of these dinners anyway. So I decided, what am I going to do with, 4,000 men and I'm the only woman? But I went, and literally the woman doing the typing or the minutes of the meeting was the only woman beside myself. But what amused me was that these are all 7th Avenue manufacturers, and I must say there were few Linkers and dress people were entirely different. The Coke and Suit, Zuckerman and Linker were one of the top, and Carmel Brothers. Carmel Brothers sent one of his younger brothers over, I think. But I was talking to Mr. Linker when the waiters came in at cocktail time at the Hotel Astor. In those days, there was those big flat-footed German waiters, and they came in these enormous black trays on their hands filled with hors d'oeuvres. And much to my absolute horror, these 7th Avenue merchants scooped up the trays with both hands and stuffed the hors d'oeuvres in their mouths as if they were never going to eat again. I was horrified, and so was Mr. Linker, who was standing by me. He looked at me, and he looked at these men, and quickly walked me away somewhere, I think, because I really was horrified. I've never seen such an exhibition of hunger, or whatever it was. It was horrifying, really. They were really scooping it with both hands. and they were all creamy, and then they'd get a handkerchief out and wipe it off and run after and get some more. What I want to tell you, which is very nice, never underestimate the power of a woman in this case. Linka made me come back the next year, and I want to tell you, not one man reached for more than one hors d'oeuvre from the tray when they walked out. And I thought, well, that really was, I think Linka put the fear of God in him, I guess. But he was French, too. Yeah. He had wonderful manners. But I love that story only for, you know, the idea that it's sad in a way, too, that these people, you know, were either hungry or had never seen food like that before in their lives. But I thought Mr. Linka's little lesson must have gone very deep. I went to a few after that, and they always behaved themselves.
How about in the area of financing? You mentioned that there were 3 textile firms that had promised you support and then didn't come through. Do you think that was because of being a woman, or?
Oh, I don't think so. I think they would have done it with a man or a woman. I don't think it had anything to do with being a woman. The one thing incident I did have that might have been from a point of view was the first money I tried to borrow, and I went over to, I think it's wasn't McGuire, but their big factor house, and they had always been nice about lending, you see, and I went over and asked for a $10,000 loan, and I had plenty of background for it by that time because I'd been in business for a while. And when you expand, you know, I think I had to put a bigger factory, you know, a new factory, something or other that I needed some more money for, and also to pay your bills. You know, you're hit at a certain time of the year in any business. And anyway, I went over to the banker, and I remember this hard-faced banker looking at bold, steely gray eyes, and he said that I'd have to put my firm in receipt. In other words, what do you call it? When you factor, you have to factor my business, which I loathe doing because it's such a bother to do that. And I said, well, you know, I have been in business and I have a lot of background. Now I really only need this for a very short period of time. He said, no, we can't do it. So, strangely enough, I looked at him and I was annoyed with him and his attitude more than anything else. He was just a steely-eyed banker and had nothing to do with human nature, and it annoyed me. And I looked at him and I said, you're just the kind of a man, if you saw starving children, you wouldn't even give them a nickel to feed their bellies. You can take my business if you like, but I would not take a nickel from you under any circumstances. And I haughtily walked out. And that night I had dinner with a friend of mine who was head of Serra de Pasco, quite a businessman, his wife, and he were very, very good friends of mine. And I was telling him my story, and he said, everybody borrows money. You shouldn't borrow money. He said, you go down. He said, you've been dealing with the Manufacturers Trust Company now for a couple of years. Go down and see my friend. This is the head, what's his name? Van Earps or Van... Marvelous man, was then the head of the whole head of the Manufacturers Trust. His name was Van Elms. And he sent me with a card down to see Mr. Van Elms. And he said, you met him at a cocktail party here, go down to see him. He said, what, $10,000, that's nothing. You have to build up your credit, borrow money, you know, and he gave me courage. Because I had just walked out that afternoon. I said, I'm going to lose my business, to hell with it. And I walked down, I took the subway down to the Manufacturers Trust, way downtown, and the difference in talking to somebody like that, in any case, because he was a great businessman, the bigger they are, the simpler they are sometimes. And I walked in, and I had had an account in the Manufacturers Trust since the first day I worked on 7th Avenue, which was, I think, 1921. $5 was my first little account. And I had my bank book there, and he had looked up. And he said, why, you've had an account at the Manufacturers Trust since 1921, young lady. You deserve to have our credit. And he wrote me out a credit for $10,000 without the drop of an eye. And I like the Manufacturers Trust for that. It's very nice. Because you do have to go to the head once in a while. I found the intermediaries are very hard to deal with sometimes.
Like anything else, I suppose, they're under such strict procedure that
It happens,
way,
you know,
right?
it happens in my business. I've had people that work for me say, "You can't see Mrs. Maxwell," and I just happen to be walking through the showroom, and I go out and said, "Well, why not, Joe?" And he looks up in great horror, you know, at my coming out in the showroom. But I loathe people saying that I can't be seen, unless I tell them that I'm in a meeting that it's very important. And then if it is somebody important, I'd still come out if I could. But I loathe people taking the idea that you're important, you can't see somebody, whether it's somebody, some little girl coming in to see you. If you always have time somehow. I'm not that well known that I have that many people pounding my doors anyway.
Well, so you're off and running then.
Oh, very definitely, yeah. Well, especially when I got to 530 7th Avenue, where I am now. And I've never, except for the 60s, I've never had a bad season.
During that period, right before you moved to 530 7th Avenue, Harper's Bazaar, in an article about you, I guess it was probably the first time that someone publicly said you were a timeless designer. And I think the statement was something like, "You can always tell a Vera Maxwell, but you can never tell what year it is."
What year it is. That's
right.
A nice, yeah. One of our great, last night on television, I was impressed by Johnson, the great architecture again, I was listening. And he said, when I designed my own house, I designed it so that in 20 years from now it would neither look very modern or very old, which I think is, and I thought of my own clothes then as when I look at some of the wall pictures that I've had for 30 years, you could wear them today really, and yet they were new at the time, and they're still in good grace for the time we're living in.
You mentioned a few moments ago that you really considered yourself a tailor. Rather than
well, when you
than
cut,
designer.
actually, you see, there is a difference. You know, actually, it stems from. It's an interesting thing that most people that study anything about clothes do know or should know about, is that there's always been, in designing clothes or making clothes of any kind, there's been the North and the South. In the North, the Eskimos, or people who had to cover themselves with clothes in the time of the Aborigines of any country, the Northerners cut skins to make clothes for themselves, and they were cut. And that went down to heavy fabrics that also had to be cut and put together with big needles. When you got farther south, they would find, they would weave, they were the first weavers that wove drapey cloths and would weave even tapa cloths that were rather soft, and they would drape those, and they were the drapers. And there's always been that actually division between, in designing. I do both, and most designers do. I mean, but even a blouse has to be tailored in some way. I do very little. I remember as a young child, I was taken to a vaudeville show, and some French designer was doing a whole act, and he took a model, and she was dressed, I remember, in very daring, then a little panty and top, very pretty, and he was draping all this fabric around her and putting roses on her shoulder, and I said, it's rather tricky and nice, but it's not really designing. You know, you take a piece of fabric and throw it around the shoulder. I think actually more designing has been done in cutting up fabrics and the weaving of the heavier fabrics, and also the weaving of Scottish tweeds or any of the northern tweeds. Flannel was done by pounding fabrics, because they had to have heavier fabrics because of the colder weather. It was done by making a loosely woven fabric laying the fibers together and then pounding them together and making a felt, which later became a lighter weight flannel. Study of fabrics is terribly interesting, I think. I always loved the idea that the herringbones came from the fishermen because they saw the herringbones on the beach and they copied the design of the herringbone, quite simply. And the bird's eye, they did a lot of hunting, and that bird's eye was fascinating to them. The shape of the bird's eye was produced in the bird's eye pattern of a tweed.
Most people have well, forgive me, but you do have many sources of design, and they've come from years of travel and years of interest in many different kinds of, many different walks of life, people from different walks of life and different locations that you've visited, etc. During the decade of 1950, if anybody had a decade, I guess you certainly did. From 1950 to 1960.
Yeah,
a quick summary before we start looking at it in some more detail. But in 1951, you received the Coty Special Award. In 1955, you were honored by Neiman Marcus by the Neiman Marcus Fashion Award, which is when you met Princess Grace, and that opened up a whole new door to life.
To life for me, I suppose. As I said, between 50 and today, I've had some of the richest experiences I've had in life. Very often through Princess Grace and my close association with her. I'm old enough to be her mother. I'm very little younger than her mother. But we hit it off, and I think I met her before she was married, but she was married the following year. I didn't go to the wedding. I wasn't invited to the wedding, but I was invited to Princess Caroline, her first child's baptism, which was very, very beautiful. But I hit it off with Renier when they came here once to America, right after their first visit to this country after they were married, and I entertained them here. And I think I won the good graces of Renier because all her bridesmaids who lived in New York and all the friends in New York couldn't have Prince Renier with inviting every aunt, uncle, sister, brother, cousin, aunt, friend that they had. And they'd all say, and Renier would say, but I don't like large parties. Oh no, this is just a few friends. And he'd arrive in these sometimes very small apartments with 60 or 70 people. And I'd been at some of the parties myself, and the reason I think Renier and I became good friends because he speaks English, like an English Don, but I'd see him in a corner, and I'm not very good at big parties, but if Grace invited me, naturally I'd go, and we'd be sitting in a corner, and he'd say, I thought this was supposed to be a small party. And, he said, are all these parties, they're all small parties like this? And I said, oh, no. And he said, there's so many people here. And he's not very good with large parties, and this I've known for years and years. And then I decided I'd give them a party, and he became a very good friend of mine. And I think that endeared him to me because this man had become a widow, and Renier is the kindest man, and he decided this man needed to change. So he invited Pierre Ray, his financial advisor, to come with him to get him away from brooding about his wife, whom he had just lost about a year and a half before. And since I speak French, I had met them for lunch, and I decided that I have a dinner party for Pierre and Grace and Renier. And Renier, with a twinkle in his eye, said, a small party again? And I said, yes. I said, dinner party. So he said, I believe you. No, he said, I don't believe you. And they came for dinner. And the only thing was that I didn't realize that Renier traveled with, in those days, a bodyguard. But he always had a bodyguard who was a friend. And this one was Frank Cressy, and he was a detective on when Kennedy he was one of the guards when Kennedy was murdered. He's a charming man. And he was there, and a great friend of Grace's, Rupert Allen, came with him. So, but I really only had 7. This is this exact table. You can see the size of it. It's an Irish hunting table, and you can only six, 7 people around it. So I had to have I had a little table on the side. So when I saw these 2 extra people come in, I had to set a table for these 2 men. And they were very funny because they acted as if they were entertaining each other. And one was a man and one was a woman. They had us hysterical listening to them. But Regnier never got over the fact that I really did have 7 people for dinner, you know, and apologized for bringing 2 extra guests. And we became very good friends after that. And I became a very good friend, and a man I learned an enormous amount from was Pierre Rey. I wish we had a diplomat like that around today. If I've ever met a real diplomat in my life, it was Pierre Rey.
Wasn't there indeed a forthcoming engagement at one point?
Well, we were going to get married, but my son got married at the same time to his first wife, and he was 34 years old. And I just somehow, the idea of marriage, you know, it was very hard to make a decision to become a French wife. Because he was enchantment, he always was a marvelous man, but Frenchmen marry really for only one reason, is raw money. Or they marry for name, or they marry a countess or something like that, or marry into the family. And he was really doing me a great honor to marry someone that had very little money in comparison to what he had, and I had no name in France, certainly. So he married me for love, or wanted to marry me for love, and I agreed to the marriage. But the minute I agreed and went over to France, Grace and Regnier were giving me a big party to announce the engagement. He became an entirely different person. I'm a very casual American, as you know, and I don't wear a hat at some time, never wear a hat, as a matter of fact, always toting somebody, always carrying a parcel or 2 handbags or books, or always toting something. And I remember the first lunch we went to, he said, "You're not wearing a hat?" And that put my back up a little, and I said, "Well, I don't have any." And he said, always in French because he couldn't speak English. He was great for my French, I must say. I speak French beautifully and fluently. Not beautifully, but fluently. And the next time I met him, he said, "You must leave that bag at home." And this is getting more irritating, by the way. And also, he didn't want me to have lunch with Grace's secretary, who was a woman. That was not being done. And I thought, good Lord, this is going to be worse and worse. And then he had a daughter who was very, very spoiled. And I had to go and see the daughter every Saturday evening. Come high, I was there for 6 weeks. And everything was beginning to irritate me, and I adored him. I loved him dearly. But I just couldn't go through with the wedding. I just thought, my life, I can't give my business up. I can't live a French wife's life. It was too confining. I mean, Grace and Regnier were a little sorry, because I think they would love to have had me over there, and I would love to have been there for their sakes. But that was rather difficult too, because he was really a servant of Regnier's, though he was a great diplomat. He was never called anything but Monsieur Rey, and it was Monseigneur and Madame, never Grace or Regnier. And I was on a Grace and Regnier basis with him, which is a very difficult equation, I could see, and it would make great difficulties somehow in my life. And I can't say I'm happy that I did or I didn't. We kept our friendship. He died, unfortunately, a few years later of cancer, but he was really one of the great diplomats I've ever met. He could calm waters that you would think could never be calmed. And Regnier, as I say, had a temper, and even in myself, I had a temper, and he could smooth the waters very easily, and was a delightful man. I have a godchild that I have over there. This daughter has a child, is one of my godchilds, charming child. I see her. I don't see the daughter very much. My son and daughter see them a lot if they go over, because she's their same age. But she was a typical French woman that loathed me too, because I would get 2/3 of her father's estate, you see, if I married him, and she couldn't stand me for that reason. So it was a difficult period of my life, but a very lovely one. But to get back to Grace and Renier, we've been very, very good friends. And I think I've appreciated Renier's humor more than anyone else. He really has a delightful sense of humor. You know, it's a particularly, yes, it's sort of an English sense of humor. It's rather a dry one. He may have learned it in his years at school in England, but their life enriched mine tremendously, because I used to go to Switzerland with them, with Pierre, and we used to go skiing in Gstaad. I skied then, and I would always love to be around the children. I have many pictures I've taken myself, not myself, but of the children, of Grace with the children, and loved reading to them. And I was like an old grandmother in the household, or an old aunt, you know, that was very comfortable, and they knew they could leave me with the children.
The extended family.
The extended family, yes. And since her mother had 24 grandchildren, I mean, I really felt that and his mother lived in Marseille in her chateau, and in Paris, and loathed I don't think she liked Monte Carlo at all. They visited her a lot, but she rarely visited them in Monaco. I only saw her twice in my life, Princess Antoinette. Princess Charlotte. Princess Antoinette is his sister. But I met people like Gary Cooper and Frank Sinatra, and certainly my dear friend David Niven and his wife. I adore them. They're both charming people. And a whole new world opened up with people like that I have to thank Grace for. Visiting places like Mallorca with them when they were first married was lots of fun, and meeting lots of people. You know, the King and Queen of Spain, who would be the King and Queen now, and also the young King Carlos and his young bride I've met. And people like, one incident always amused me. We were in Naples, and Renier had a lovely old yacht. It was called the Costa del Sol, and it was an old orange crate that he and Grace did over into a superb yacht. The only thing wrong with it didn't have air conditioning, and in those warm climates it was a bit uncomfortable. But I loved it. And we were in Naples one year, and in the port of Naples, and alongside of us was Lopez, Arturo Lopez, one of the richest men in the world, had a yacht. And I adored Grace and Renier's yacht because it was what I called a boat. The bunks were bunks, and everything was built in, and it was very like a sailor's boat, you know. And actually, George Stacy was her interior decorator, and Renier's, and he did the boat, and he found old wood and paneling from older boats and put it in this boat. The dining room was a dream. It had a big old table from an old boat captain's, enormous captain's cabin. The drawing room was charming. The bunks, as I said, the staterooms were real staterooms. And I'll never forget, we were invited for cocktails to Arturo Lopez's boat. And it was like a seraglio on the sea. I mean, I was really, it was ghastly looking for my taste. I mean, Louis Quinze gilt, satin brocade. I mean, it was just filled with the luxuries that you picture a very, very high-class courtesan's house would be in Paris, you know. And a very funny thing happened. I was introduced to him. He paid no attention to me. You know, when you're introduced to somebody and they turn away, you know, someone else, that was typical of Arthur, unless he knew who you were. He hadn't any idea who I was. And he did have the dining room. Again, he had one enormous panel of a Chinese portrait, and the dining room was all chinoiserie of that period too. You know, late 19th century or middle 19th century. And I looked at this great big, beautiful Chinese panel painted. And I particularly liked it because, first, it looked familiar. And I looked at it again, and I spent many, many hours when my aunt lived in Brighton or Hove at George the Fourth's, that exhibition hall, if you've ever seen it. It's called the Exhibition Pavilion. It's called a pavilion by the English, and it's full of early 19th century, you know, beautiful things. And in their dining room, in George the Fourth's dining room at the pavilion, are 3 enormous panels on 3 walls. And the third wall, it had, this panel was lost, and we were not able to find it when Queen Mary did this whole thing over. And here was the one, the missing panel that I found in Arturo's yacht. And he had about 4 or 5 people, and he was showing them around here, and I said, Mr. Lopez, do you know that you have the missing panel from the pavilion at Brighton? I said, it belongs to Queen Mary of England, who was still alive then. No, I guess she wasn't alive then. She may have been. I don't think so. She had just died, but she had, before she died, she had done these. And he said, how did you know that? And I said, I've spent hours in the pavilion, and there's a wall that said they don't know where the 4th panel is. And the reason I spent so much time looking at it is because the first Chinese paintings of any kind that I'd ever seen that were done the way, not in mandarin's clothes, or they were done in peasant Chinese fashion. A mother and her 3 children had a knitted dress on, which I'd never seen before. And that's why I spent so much time looking at it from a fashion point of view. And also, whenever you saw anything like that, it was either the grandees of Spain, or the emperors of China, or the mandarins of China, or the kings of Spain, or the kings of France. You very rarely saw, except Peter de Hook of Flemish fame. He always painted what the lowly peasant in Holland would wear. And I've always been drawn to paintings like that saw people as they were, not the people that were in portraits and by Gainsborough, things like that. But he was very impressed by that I knew that. It was the only thing I remember about it. But that yacht was fantastic. But experiences like that were marvelous. I did meet, I think I told you once, at a very small dinner party at Grayson Regnier's house at Roc Argel, which is way over the mountaintop of Monaco. It's 1,000 feet in the air in a beautiful spot. And they have this really old farmhouse there, the Provençal type of farmhouse. And I was there with just the family for a few days, and it was delightful during the day. We gardened, Grace and I gardened, and Regnier actually got on a tractor and would get out with one of his handymen. They loved getting back, and I'd read to the children. Carolyn was only 2.5 years old then, so it's quite a while ago, being 22 now. And Albert was only 1.5 years, so I would spend my day playing in the children's playhouses with them, with Nana, their governess. But at night, they would always have a few guests up for dinner from Monaco, and a especially memorable evening for me was the evening I met Churchill and his wife, who were visiting at the Hotel de Paris, and they came for dinner that night with their daughter. And I think it was the secretary of the prince that was there, the secretary of Churchill that was there. But Mrs. Churchill at dinner one night, they were talking about the divorce of their daughter, and how Mrs. Churchill was saying how rude. I was thinking of this probably because Regnier is having a problem with his son-in-law, but they had a problem with their son-in-law, and the daughter had just divorced. And Mrs. Churchill saying, well, you know, it was very difficult for Winston because he just didn't get along with the son-in-law. And actually, the son-in-law asked such really stupid questions. And one day he asked Churchill, who is your favorite person in all the world? And Churchill turned around and said, Mussolini. And he said, "Oh," he said, "Father, that is ridiculous. Why do you pick Mussolini?" He said he had the good sense. Winston turned around and said Mussolini had the good sense to kill his son-in-law. And I said, that put his son-in-law in place. Mrs. Churchill said it with a twinkle in her eye, you know.
Yeah.
It was rather a cute saying. But it really made a great difference. And I don't know whether it made a great difference in my designing, but it certainly made a great difference in my life. I did learn a lot about different fabrics, too, from traveling around. And actually, in Switzerland, I learned about washed woolens. I don't know whether you know, you make, in Germany, Bavaria, they knit wool, not too loosely, but they'll knit a fabric by machine or by hand, whichever. Years ago they did it by hand, of course. They'd boil it. And if you've ever seen these Tyrolean jackets of boiled wool, you'll never forget them. They can stand by themselves. But I did do that. I've tried things like that, and it didn't go over. It broke my heart because I bought yards and yards of, I kept testing it. And I would get piece goods people and say, we don't know anything about that. And I take them home and boil them. I take 5 yards and boil it myself, you know, until I get the proper consistency. It boils so it gets almost felty, and it's called boiled wool. And those Tyrolean jackets with the silver buttons, the woolen ones, are invariably made of boiled wool. You can hardly see that it's knitted when you boil it. It's so finely condensed, you see. And it never wears out. It's just, you know, you couldn't possibly wear it out. And I think Jessica Daves had bought my sample. I don't think I sold one. And I had yards and yards of boiled wool around, you know, testing it. And I had finally found someone to boil it for me. And I had, you know, a whole piece of it on my shelves for years. I finally gave it away to someone. But I've tested a lot of fabrics. Another fabric I tested out was jalaba cloth from Morocco. And I've got that. I never used in my life a middleman or a buying agent. I couldn't stand them. I found out early in life when I was working for other people that when I was sent abroad to go to a buying agency, they would invariably, and I was smart enough to know, they were taking me to the people that they were getting a rebate from. And I couldn't convince Mr. Milstein, or that I did convince Mr. Milstein, but I never could convince Mr. Linker that it was ridiculous to have a middleman. I used to go out and I'd leave the middleman, and as I told you, I bought, you know, 5,000 yards of fabric at 3 shillings a yard, that if I couldn't have found with a middleman. I would find out where these people were in Golden Square, and always find out for myself. And when I was in business for myself, I did that. I went to Morocco very early in my business for myself, and was fascinated by the jalabas that they wore. You don't see them much in these days. But they're all only 6-yard lengths and only worn by men and boys. And there are special looms that they make. The women spin the yarn. And if you go into the country at all, which I did with friends of mine that were living there at the time, outside of Tangier, you'd walk along these hills where there were sheep and goats and camel. And there were bushes, very scraggly bushes. And before you, you'd see women in shawls with a spindle. And they'd pull the wool off the bushes that were there, that were left, even those they used. And they'd spin the yarn on string, on cotton string, and they'd do it by hand, spin this yarn by hand. They'd go home at night, probably. They never, evidently, they spun all the time, like Penelope. And they'd go home at night and have the goat hair. So what comprised the jalaba was goat hair, camel hair, all on string, all spun on a piece of string to give it some body. Horsehair, anything would be spun into this in the most marvelous browns, grays, all natural shades. It was never in any color. I dyed it. I bleached it and dyed it in colors later on. Still, I sold a little bit of it that way. But I have a jalaba coat myself that I adore. And that's another thing that I think Nancy White has a jalaba coat that she bought. And they were the only two people I know, beside myself, that still have one. I must have sold about 50 coats, that's all. But I said, I still have a whole bolt of jalaba cloth that I don't, because it's not being made, not a bolt, yard ends of jalaba cloth that I have still with me. And I still have a piece of the dyeing I finally, my friend over there went to a place and had a bolt of it done, 30 yards, as long as they could do it. And I had that done, brought it here, and it still was done. I said, keep it in as light a color as you can. They had it in light colors. I bleached it and dyed it in a lovely rose color and blue. And I sold that a little bit, but not much. But for the effort I put into it, it was never very well taken, you know, by the populace. There are many fabrics. Loden cloth I brought from my Austrian background. I brought that back from my first year in Vienna and in Salzburg. I adored it. And I made it very dressy. I showed it with turquoise. It had a natural affinity for turquoise. It was always in that lovely shade of what I call Lodencloth green. It does come in brown, but I used it mostly in the Lodencloth green. And I never put that over. It never sold very well, despite all my romantic feelings about it. My father used to tell us stories about Maximilian. Emperor Maximilian was the first Holy Roman Emperor of the German or Austrian Holy Roman Emperors after Charlemagne, who was his life was supposed to be saved because he was caught in a blizzard in his Lodencloth cape, and it was so warm that it kept him alive through the night until the dogs got him and gave him whiskey. But I always felt very romantic about Lodencloth, and I put my heart and soul into it, but it didn't sell very well. I have a few friends that have returned a Lodencloth coat that I did years ago. But what appalled me was later on, one of our big fabric houses here sold it by the yards with Edelweiss in the buttonholes, imitation Edelweiss, and it annoyed me somehow because I guess I have a definite feeling against promotions of any kind, and I suppose that's why a lot of my designs were never promoted that I had great feeling for, like Lodencloth or like the jalaba cloth. I never made a point of it. I didn't think you should do that. You know, I didn't have somebody going from coast to coast and saying this is the most wonderful thing that ever happened to fashion. And I'm glad in a way because it's fun to look back at these things you were able to do. The one thing I have done that has lasted all these years since 1949 was the East Indian wild silk. That took on, and I still use it. I use it every year, and I do it. I've printed wild silk. I've done all sorts of things with wild silk. I've used a very heavy grade of wild silk, and I'm still using it. And that's the only thing I think I can think of. And Harris tweed, I still use. I dyed. I had Harris tweed dyed in off-white. That was the closest they could get, sort of a soft off-white. And I had them dye it in pink and blue, and that was in vogue in Harper's. Harris tweed was done in very feminine colors and very successful because women evidently liked a coat that lasted a long while and that was made of this beautiful fabric, Harris tweed, also hand woven and hand spun. Hand weaving doesn't mean a thing. It's the hand spinning of the yarn, as they do with the East Indian wild silk. The one thing I brought back that fell like a ton of bricks was a beautiful Bavarian linen. It's unobtainable now, but I went through the Rhineland, and literally in the back of a car, I stashed away as many pieces as I could. And I left a check with a man that promised me 250 yards of it. And I left it in American Express, and they are so honest in that country. That fabric came through right to the day it was promised. But that didn't sell. I gave 150 yards of it to Jessica Daves, who had her summer house covered with this poor Jessica is no longer with us, but I'd love to know where all that beautiful linen is. It's still, you couldn't wear it out, you know. It's very heavy linen. They make the summer linen coat. The men wear those beautiful summer linen jackets with silver buttons and green felt on the collars. Very good looking. And usually a red plaid lining. It's almost classic, you know, in its look. Those are the only fabrics I remember having difficulty with. I almost had that difficulty to come up to today with the suede, the ultra suede, that Nancy White gave me a swatch of, and I thought it was, I used to use something called Gazelda years ago. They came in very small skins, and you could, it was very patchy because the skins were so small. You'd have to do a skirt with 6 parts to it, you know, and a little short jacket, and that would have, you know, the sleeve would be in 2 pieces. But it was a beautiful fabric, and we were not allowed to use it because it was an unborn lamb or something, or a very baby lamb, and it was, you know, it was being extinct, so we weren't allowed to use that. And that was in something like 41, or just before the war. And Nancy gave me this little swatch, and I said, where did you get Gazelda? I thought, she said, it isn't. It's made in Japan, and it's, she said, unfortunately, they won't sell it to anybody else but the French couturiers. And I said, do you mind my keeping the swatch? And she said, no, not at all. But I had bought silks from Japan since 1929. I have known 2 houses in Japan that were working with the people I worked for. Adler & Adler used silk from Japan. And I had still, his name is Mr. Levine. And I called him on the phone, and I said, do you know anything about Toray, a house called Toray? And he said, yes, they're making a new fabric. And I said, I'd like to know something about it. I said, somebody from Harper's Bazaar gave me a little swatch of it. And I said, they won't sell it in America. And I said, I'd love to get it. And he said, I'll see what I can do. And about 2 weeks later, 3 little Japanese walked into my showroom, bowing and scraping, handing me visiting cards. And I showed them quickly all my Harper's and Vogue colored, you know, pictures, and those that I was the proudest of, that I had hanging in my showroom, and my latest bit of publicity from wherever. And they were properly impressed. And only one of them spoke English. And I asked them, I had to buy $40,000 worth of the fabric, but they showed me the color card, and they brought me a big piece of it, which they left with me. Actually, they left me 5 yards, I think, of a piece that they had. And I was delighted, because I just liked the cloth even better in a larger piece. And he said it was washable and all the things. And I've always been a tester of fabrics, and I went home. I made an order out for 40,000 yards in about 11 colors, and it was a beautiful fabric. And I washed it, and I sewed it, and we had to have a special needle for it. That we found out right away. And I put some coffee stains on it, or tea stains on it. Tea stain, very hard to get out. They came out immediately. It dried perfectly, didn't need to be pressed. And I was very impressed, and I was delighted I had 40,000 yards of it, and those beautiful colors were absolutely magnificent. I remember I had 11 colors, and it arrived, and I did a collection of it, and it fell flat on its face. No one bought it. And fortunately for me, Halston sold it over the, you know, in his couturier workrooms to Anne Ford and Charlotte Ford and all the very wealthy creme de la creme that I don't sell retail at all. I just sell wholesale. And he sold it to those people. And evidently it was spotted across the country because enough of those people bought from small specialty shops around the country. And the minute they walked in, and they also found out that that Halston was using it, they remembered that I had it. And the second year that I had it, I was just about to sell it. And suddenly I had an influx of people buying my ultra suede. Otherwise I would have been almost sold it, 10 cents on the dollar.